Welcome to panel 4 of the PSA Parliaments Specialist Group Virtual Conference. It was recently described in our newsletter as an intellectual beacon amid the darkness of the pandemic, which I think is a statement that we can uncritically accept at face value. Thanks for that, Stephen. Now, today, carrying the torch and shining light on the darkness of the question about analysing legislative scrutiny and behaviour, we've got 4 great speakers lined up for you. Nokwazi Makanya of the University of Edinburgh, Andrew Jones, University of Exeter, and Jack Sheldon, University of Cambridge, and Margaret Arnott of the University of West Scotland are all going to be sharing their research with you. Leading us off, please may I introduce Nokwazi, who's going to take the first presentation slot here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gavin, and thanks to everyone for this opportunity to share this case study with you. So just before I begin, just to say the presentation that I will be giving forms part of a broader research that I'm doing for my thesis, which is looking at the incentives and disincentives that political actors in the South African budget process face. So this is just a small part within that broader study. And primarily the data collection which informed the study was from interviews with MPs of the budget committees in the South African Parliament, as well as senior officials in the National Treasury in South Africa, and other senior officials who are in non-government organizations, but are key authoritative actors in the budget process. So that's very briefly what my presentation will be. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I'll be using the South African legislative budget process to discuss the steps and procedures that the South African Parliament has made over the years towards achieving its aim of strengthening legislative influence in the budget process. Now, part of this and part of what this illuminates is also power relations between the executive and the legislature in budget decision making. Now, although there is, background context and motivations as to why look into legislative influence in the budget process, linked to broader studies of the impact of legislature on policy. What I'd like to instead focus on is just on the South African context specifically and its journey towards legislative budgetary powers. But I'd be more than happy to discuss more of the theoretical background during our discussions in the Q&A session. So beyond what institutional theories of parliamentary systems provide, what I'd like to focus on is what are the contextual variables that explain how and why the South African Parliament's influence on the budget differs from what formally conferred powers would predict. So the focus will be on democratic South Africa, so post-1994, a very important time frame, considering that with the advent of democracy, there was quite a series of constitutional and other reforms, which are important to bear in mind. So just to establish then very strongly the South African context and where it places Parliament in budget decision making. So in the Constitution of 1996, which was about 2 years after the democratic transition. So already within the Constitution, the highest law in the land, there already is a provision which requires that there should be specific legislation for Parliament, which provides a procedure for them to be able to amend the budget. So already contained in the Constitution itself. Now that specific legislation, it was only enacted more than 10 years later in 2009, and that is the Money Bills Amendment Act, enacted in 2009. And what that act does, it not only empowers Parliament to be able to amend or reject the budget, to accept or reject the budget, but it also empowers them to be able to make their own amendments on the budget to what the executive has proposed. So that with that foundation in legislation, then it very clearly establishes what Parliament's authority is and what it should be in budget decision making. So then with that foundation of formal legislation, as well as the institutional arrangements, which I'll be discussing, the question then is that to what extent can formal powers, as well as parliamentary institutions, to what extent can they be expected to advance this aspiration of greater legislative influence in the budget? Now, when considering what literature suggests in terms of what are the key factors which contributes to Parliament's influence on budget decision-making, I'll be discussing these three factors in relation to the South African context, but also what you'll see as I progress is that while these are documented as factors, in the South African case, they are presenting themselves slightly more as constraints to Parliament exercising these powers. So the first one is with respect to the extent of formal powers. So as I mentioned before, Parliament has been granted these powers already within the Constitution and within an auxiliary legislation, which is the Money Bills Amendment Act. But important just to raise then that what emerges in the South African context is that although this formal legislation is in place, the powers which Parliament has to amend the budget, they are neither constrained, so constrained to the extent that they're not just limited to accepting or rejecting, but they can amend as well. But they're also not unfettered rights. So Parliament cannot just make amendments with no limits. So when looking into the detail of what's contained in the legislation, yes, theoretically, they do have the powers to amend, but the extent of the limitations and the onerous conditions and procedures which are required to amend the budget, that presents itself as quite a constraint for South African MPs. So they're quite extensive, but just to give you maybe one or two examples. So one example is following their scrutiny, Parliament can amend the budget, but they should ensure that those changes do not exceed the aggregate total or do not increase the budget deficit, for example. Another example would be that when Parliament proposes amendments that they can make to the budget, they should also supply additional evidence which will illustrate what the impact of those changes will be on service delivery. So quite a lot of conditions contained within the legislation itself. The second key factor to speak about is with respect to institutional capacity. Now, what the Finance and Appropriation Committees in the South African Parliament, those are the committees involved in budget decision making. They have access to researchers, content advisors, but in addition to that, they have access to independent and objective analysis and research information from a parliamentary budget office, as well as a fiscal and financial commission. But what's important perhaps to highlight here is that the availability of research and analytical advice to MPs, the availability of such resources doesn't necessarily mean that the MPs will have the capacity to absorb all of that information. And that is certainly something that has come out from the South African context, is that yes, there have been improvements towards empowering and strengthening Parliament's analytical ability in terms of the budget, but MPs are not always able to absorb and make use of that information. Now, added to that as well is that within the budget calendar, the MPs have very, very limited time to scrutinize the budget and even be able to make amendments where they feel necessary. So that is already presenting a constraint in itself. And then the third and perhaps more interesting factor relates to the incentives that individual MPs face in budget decision making. So I'll discuss the four sub elements within that. The first relates to the system of government that South Africa is. So dating back from its British colonial heritage, South Africa has a parliamentary system. But when looking at the form of the parliamentary system today, there have been some modifications to what was inherited from its colonial heritage. Now, why it's important to, why the parliamentary system as a factor is important is that, I mean, like many other countries with parliamentary system, there are some inherent features of this kind of system, of this kind of design. And what is evident and what relates to budget decision-making is that the executive is very much dependent on majority support in the legislature. And the nature of the executive and the legislature's relations are such that it's highly unlikely that Parliament will challenge the executive government. So the relations are a bit more cooperative. Now, one point to perhaps highlight is that one specific change that the South African government made is in terms of the proportional representation electoral system. Now, that change occurred specifically with the transition to democracy in 1994. And this is where it sort of discontinued from what was previously inherited, which is similar to the Westminster system of a plurality rule. Now, why it's important to reflect on this proportional representative electoral system is that, so one of the reasons that the South African government chose to adopt this form of electoral system was, you know, the advantages that this kind of system presented. So perhaps the most glaring or the most obvious is that it's a system which is very much inclusive, in that it technically allows even the smallest party to be able to win seats in the legislature, thereby contributing to having various views and interests and debates when deciding on South African policy. And again, just to say, with the South African system, unlike other proportional representation systems where there is a threshold on the minimum percentage that parties should have to win seats, in the South African case, there is no threshold. So as you can see, for instance, there are parties that just have one seat, but who are still allowed to be able to be representatives in the parliament. Now, the system, the proportional representation system, then obviously therefore contributes to, you know, a democratic electoral process, which is conducive to more than one party dominating. However, what is evident in the South African case is that despite the system of perfect proportionality, what has been the case since 1994 to date is that South Africa is a one-party dominant system. So the ANC has consistently had majority voting outcome since 1994. So despite the intentions of perfect proportionality, it's a one-party dominant system. And within that, within policy making and budget decision making, there are some implications there. And perhaps the one thing to mention is that, you know, another characteristic of the one-party dominant system worth emphasizing is that the current governing ruling party always has had and continues to have a strong unity and very tight party discipline. And what that has done is that it has given the executive a sense of certainty every year, in that there's predictability, in that the budget proposals will almost always be approved and voted for, despite legislation giving Parliament the formal powers to be able to amend the budget. And then on the last few points about the incentives that MPs face, these relate to the 5-year tenure, or the 5-year period in which every parliament sits, together with the high turnover that we see in budget committees. So this does present a disincentive, because with the change, or with new incoming parliaments, almost all committee members are new. In fact, looking at the budget committees in the current parliament, only one member returned from the previous parliament. So when considering the number of years that it takes to be able to build up the expertise, improve scrutiny of the budget, and MPs knowing that within a 5-year period, they're likely not to return, it acts as some sort of disincentive for them to be more active in the budget process. And then the last factor just relates to the relative strength of opposition parties. So as I mentioned before, there certainly are very many parties represented in the South African Parliament, including in the budget committees as well. And certainly when in the budget meetings that I have observed and sat in on, there certainly is a sense of robust debate, robust presence of opposition parties. However, the fact that they are relatively that much smaller just means that they are ultimately not influential in swaying policymaking and decisions on the budget. And then finally, on the very last slide, just to say then, so what has the progress been then to date in terms of South Africa's parliament and their power of the purse? So first, just to start off by saying that to date, parliament has not exercised the powers that they have to be able to challenge the executive government in making budget amendments. And what we're seeing is that looking only at the formally conferred powers as well as the institutional capacity. So when I discuss those two factors on their own, it was already clear to see that even on their own, they are very limiting. But we see that when they have to interact with the political incentives, it then just illuminates even more how limited Parliament's powers actually are. And so just to highlight the sort of two emerging propositions in literature which the South African context is challenging or contradicting. So the one refers to the availability of formal powers. So what the literature would suggest is that the availability of these powers and institutional arrangements reflect the legislature's budgetary power. But what the South African case is showing that even with these powers in form or in theory, formally, the local political settings in the South African context are just not conducive to Parliament exercising its budgetary power. So in other words, the Parliament will never challenge the executive government as they both have the same electoral fates and they are both from the same political party. And then the second important one, sure, very last slide. The second important one just to highlight is that there is a suggestion that when there is a separation of powers between the legislature and the executive, this will ensure that the majority government does not dominate its party in Parliament. Again, what we're seeing in South Africa is that this is certainly not the case. The current ruling party, the ANC, dominates within and outside of Parliament. And one of the things that has come out is that with the ANC being a liberation party movement, one of the traits of that is that there is no strong history of individualized or independent behavior of MPs. So all in all, it's then leading then to the conclusion of seeing that, despite the specific steps, reforms, and legislation that have taken place, the formal powers to enhance, formal powers are seen rather to enhance Parliament's legitimacy in democratic budget decision-making, rather than facilitating them exercising their actual power over the purse.